it's Dr. Joy here, and you are watching Delivering Joy MD. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And I am super excited about today's episode because we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty details of the Pap smear. You may remember that last week we talked about Pap smear versus pelvic exam. And so this week we're really going to break down the Pap smear, how it's done, what the results can be, and how those results affect the way that you need to follow up to make sure that you're staying on top of cervical cancer screening. So definitely keep on watching. So, okay, we are about to get into the nitty-gritty details of the Pap smear. So if you've been watching my channel, you'll know that last week we talked about a Pap versus a pelvic exam. And so today I really wanted to expand upon the Pap smear because I think it's really important. I feel like it's been sort of like a mystery for all these years. And a lot of women may know that they had an abnormal Pap, but they really don't understand what makes it abnormal. So I see a lot of women who are just very confused about what all of those results mean and what that medical jargon stuff means. And so today we're going to break that down. So the first thing I want to do is a little bit of review from last week. And so if you didn't catch that video, I'm going to post it down in the description box. And so make sure that you check that video out so you can kind of understand some of the background for this video. And make sure you subscribe, girl, because you don't want to be missing videos. So today, let's get really in depth about the Pap smear. So the first thing that we're going to do is a pelvic exam. And so we talked about how a pelvic exam involves placing a speculum. And so this is a speculum. It's just kind of a small plastic tool that helps us actually insert into the vagina so we can open it up and see the cervix that's all the way in the back of the vagina. And if you're not too up on your anatomy, make sure you catch the video that I did on learning your lady parts. I'll link that in the description box below as well so that you can catch up on that. But the cervix is basically the opening to the uterus or to the womb where the baby lives. And so the speculum helps us actually see that cervix so that we can collect a sample. And if you are over 21 years of age, you definitely want to finish this video to the end because you want to know all about the Pap. So as we talked about last week, we don't start doing Pap smears in women who are under 21, okay? So you definitely want to make sure if you are having a Pap smear, which is perfectly okay to question whether or not you're getting a pelvic exam or a Pap smear, you want to make sure you're 21 years of age, okay? There are only very few, very rare instances in which women under 21 need to be having a Pap smear done, okay? So we put the speculum in, and then we actually take a sample from the cervix using this soft plastic brush. And so if the cervix looks kind of like a little mini donut at the back of the vagina, this little brush actually goes right into the center of that mini donut, and we kind of twirl it around a little bit to scrape off a few of the cells. And so it doesn't really hurt. It may feel a little uncomfortable sometimes, but most women say, you know, it's uncomfortable, but it's not really painful. So once this brush has been used to collect some sample, we actually put it into our Pap testing liquid. And most people are using liquid Pap bases these days. And so we would actually put that there. And then your sample goes off to the lab. People may use a variety of tools to collect the sample. Like they may use what's called a cyto brush, which is also going to help get some cells from the inside part of that little mini donut or the cervix back there. And so once all of that is collected, we send that off to the lab. And what happens with it is that they're going to get the cells out of the fluid and they're going to put it on a microscope slide. And the microscope slide is stained with special stain, the Papaniculau stain, which is why we call it a Pap smear. And so once that's done, it can be looked at under the microscope. And when we look at it under the microscope, we're really looking to make sure that the cells that have come off your cervix look normal. And if they look normal, there's not very much else to do with that. So let's break it down a little bit by age groups, because based on how old you are, it plays a definitive role in what we're going to do with your particular pap smear sample. So let's break it down for my young tenderonis first. So young ladies who are 21 years of age up until 30 will just simply get the actual slide that we make with the cells and that we stain and look at under the microscope. So you're going to get that test, and someone, or in some cases there are some artificial intelligence machines that read pap smears. So that pap smear will be read, and if your cells are normal, then you're not going to have anything else done. So as long as you have normal cells, you're just getting that little smear, and you're going to get that every 3 years as long as it's normal. Now, let's say they happen to find an abnormality, and we're definitely going to break down what kind of abnormalities there are, because most women only know that their pap smear was abnormal and they don't really understand, like, well, what was abnormal about it. So we'll break that down in a few minutes, but just so you know, if you see abnormal cells, if abnormal cells come back on your pap, then you also will receive what's called a human papillomavirus test, or an HPV test. We know that there are many strains of HPV, I think we're up to maybe 12 now, that can cause cervical cancer. And so we are actually looking for those particular strains of the human papillomavirus. And so if those are present, then we're going to make some determinations about what you need to do next for follow-up. And we're definitely going to cover that in this video, so make sure you keep on watching. So for my girls who are in their dirty 30s and up to the 60s, are going to have not only the pap smear test where the cells are looked at under the microscope, but they're also going to get the human papillomavirus test, and that's just going to be standard. Most places offer this testing. Every now and then there are some places that don't offer the HPV testing, which would mean that you would definitely need to still be having your pap smear every 3 years. But if you have had normal pap smears and your pap smear, the slide that's looked at under the microscope, and your HPV testing are normal, then you don't have to get another actual pap smear for 5 years. That doesn't mean you won't need a pelvic exam, but it just means you don't have to use the little plastic brush to kind of collect cells from the cervix, right? So that's called co-testing. When that happens is when you have the pap smear that's looked at under the microscope, and then you have the HPV testing that looks for HPV that could cause cervical cancer. So if you have had co-testing, then you really don't have to have another pap smear for 5 years. So make sure you're kind of aware of what your doctor does or your provider does when you're going to get your pap smear. If they do the co-testing, meaning they're doing the pap smear and the HPV testing, then you're good for 5 years if your pap comes back good. That does not mean that you don't need to visit your doctor for 5 years. Yes, ma'am, you do. You still need to come in for your well woman checkup every year as your annual physical. So don't try to get away with that and say, oh, well, Dr. Joy said I only need to come every 5 years. No, girl, you got to come every year still. But you won't have to get the little scrapey scrape every year, okay? So let's move on to thinking about abnormalities with the pap, because that's really where people kind of start to get a little shaky and get, become afraid. So the pap smear can be used for many things along with looking for cervical cancer. So many pap smears, like in these samples here, can actually also look for things like gonorrhea, chlamydia, trichomonas, bacterial vaginosis, and yeast. So just because one of those bacterial STD testing or yeast infection testing comes back positive does not mean that your actual pap smear is abnormal. So let's make sure we got that down, because sometimes people will say, well, I had an abnormal pap because I had BV. No, you did not have an abnormal pap, but we were able to test for BV using this same test. And so now you know that you have bacterial vaginosis. It has nothing to do with cervical cancer. So I just want to make sure that we clear that up. while it's really convenient that we just have to take one sample and we can look for all these different things, the main goal of the pap smear is to check for cervical cancer. So we want to get some of those cells and make sure they're normal and that we're not worried about cervical cancer, right? So abnormal paps really have to do with abnormal cells that have come off your cervix. And so there are many abnormalities that can occur. There's kind of a continuum. So there can be what's called ascus, that's ASCUS, and it's really just kind of like an acronym for atypical squamous cells of undetermined significance. So that basically means that your cells look a little funny, but we're not sure if it's anything bad going on, right? So if you have that come back, then the thing that's going to matter the most is what your HPV or your human papillomavirus test results as. So if you have a negative HPV test, then there really is nothing that we need to do at that point, because it means your cells look a little funny, but you don't have the virus that could lead to cervical cancer. So we're not going to worry about it, but we would definitely want to repeat that pap smear in 1 year versus 3 or 5 years, right? So that's something that you should know about. So that's kind of like, just slightly abnormal, not really sure what it means. Next on the spectrum would be low grade SIL. So, oh my gosh, they come up with like the hardest names for these pap smear results, but low grade SIL actually means low grade squamous interepithelial lesion. And that's like a mouthful even for me, but we call it LCIL for short. So LCIL means that the cells look a little bit abnormal. We're pretty sure that this is due to human papillomavirus being present on the cervix. And so sometimes people will still check the HPV testing, but really you don't have to, because if you have an LCIL pap, you can pretty much assume, you can bank on that person has human papillomavirus in the cells of the cervix. So that's, a little bit more definitive than just the atypical squamous cells. And so after LCIL comes HCIL. And HCIL means high grade squamous interepithelial lesion. And that means that we are concerned, right? We're concerned that there is HPV present and that this may be a precancerous lesion. So we're really concerned about the high grade squamous interepithelial lesion, or HCIL pap. So the HCIL pap is definitely something that we really want to have close follow-up on. So if your pap comes back and it says, high grade squamous interepithelial lesion, or HCIL, you need to be all over that. Okay, so that's the girl that I'm always worried about, who maybe sometimes misses appointments or we can't find her, because she's going to need some further workup for that. So there are a couple of other different pap results that we could see. One is called ASK-H. So remember, we said ASCUS, ASCUS, stands for atypical squamous cells of undetermined significance. Well, ASK-H is one of the pap smears that we can see. So basically, they're saying that you have atypical squamous cells, but they cannot rule out a high-grade lesion. So we see something that looks a little abnormal, but we're not quite sure whether or not it could also be a high-grade lesion. And so we just talked about high-grade. It's not what we want to hear. So we want to try to make sure that if we hear that high grade, that we're all on top of the follow-up. And we'll get into follow-up in just a few minutes. So ASK-H also needs additional follow-up for sure, because it could be undetermined, significance for those squamous cells, or it could be a high-grade lesion. So we got to stay on top of that particular result. The other one that we see is what's called atypical glandular cells of undetermined significance, or the acronym is AGUS, like AGUS. So what we want to see when we see that AGUS pap is whether or not there's something going on inside the uterus that's causing uterine cells to come down into the cervix. And so we really kind of want to follow that one up too. That's something that we mostly see in women who are like around the time of menopause or postmenopausal. And so for our younger ladies, that is definitely of concern whenever we see that. And even in our more seasoned ladies, we really pay close attention to that August pap smear. So I want to kind of hit on the follow-up for these, because once you get that message that, oh my God, I have an abnormal pap smear, the first thing you're thinking is I have cervical cancer. So you can stop thinking that, y'all. So the first thing that we want to know is, what was my actual result? Was it ascus, like atypical squamous cells of undetermined significance? Was it LCL, low-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions? Or was it ASK-H, meaning that we're not quite sure what's going on with these cells, but it could be a high-grade lesion? Or is it actually HCL, which would be a high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesion? So once we know what that is, we know where we are on the continuum, and that's really going to kind of debulk some of this fear and anxiety. I mean, nobody wants to hear they have an abnormal pap, but if it's me and I'm thinking about it in terms of, well, what exactly are the results? If my result is ascus, then I'm like, okay, let's stay on top of this, let's pay attention. But if it's HCL, that's a lot more cause for concern, right? So if you have an HCL pap, you need to be knocking on the doors, beating down the doors, making sure that you're getting back to your gynecologist and saying, hey, what's the plan for this? Because I need to make sure that, I'm not developing cervical cancer over the next couple of years. So the HCL is, what we call a precancerous lesion. And then, of course, cervical cancer can certainly be present, and that can be picked up sometimes with the pap smear. So let's get into the follow-up. So what we're following is just to make sure that if you have abnormal cells and that you're positive for HPV, that you are not slowly progressing to cervical cancer. And so when we chat next, we're going to talk about HPV and really kind of break that down. But just for the purposes of today's video, just know that if you have abnormal cells plus HPV and you are 25 years of age or older, then you're going to need to undergo what's called a colposcopy, or what we just call in the GYN world a colpo for short. And basically what a colposcopy means, colpo means cervix, and oscopy basically means camera. So we put in a speculum and we actually look at the cervix with a microscope. So we're trying to make sure that we can see the whole cervix. We can really see some of those cells that are present there, and that if we see abnormal cells, that we're actually going to take a small biopsy of those cells. We also will take a small biopsy of the cells that are inside of the cervix, so that just in case if those are the ones that are causing the abnormal pap smear and we don't see them really well when we put in a speculum, that we are getting some of those and making sure that we are assessing the entire cervix. And so remember, we said the cervix looks like a little mini donut. So we'll see all of this part with the microscope, but we can't actually see inside there. And so we're actually getting some of the cells from the inside where you can't see if we're doing a colposcopy. The reason why we do that is because we want to make sure that, say for instance, the cytology or the study where they looked at your cells under the microscope for your pap smear matches up with the actual tissue that we get. So cells and tissue are pretty different in terms of how we evaluate them. So cells, you can kind of screen for things, but you actually need tissue to diagnose cervix. And by tissue, I mean really like a little teeny weeny pinch biopsy off of the cervix. By the time you get it done and say ouch, it'll be over. But that tissue is very important because it helps us make sure that our pap smear and what is actually happening on the cervix match up. So let's say, for example, I had an ascus pap. And so I know that that's, not too bad, but if I got the colposcopy done and I had a little biopsy done and it came back as high grade, that is pretty bad. So we have to make sure that we evaluate these abnormal paps, especially in a woman who has positive human papillomavirus. And so we want to make sure we evaluate that and know what the tissue shows. So if the tissue shows that, yes, it's just mild changes, then okay, we're good. We'll wait a year and come back and repeat the pap. If the tissue sample shows that, yes, this is in fact a high-grade lesion and we need to do additional workup, then we can do that. And so that's why the most important thing about having an abnormal pap result is how you follow up. Follow up, follow up, follow up. I used to have a friend that would say the fortune is in the follow up. So if you have an abnormal pap, make sure you are on top of your follow up. It's absolutely necessary because we think that it probably takes several years, maybe 3 to 7 years, for you to develop cervical cancer. All that is that you've missed a few years with your GYN appointments. And sometimes I see women that haven't been in for 15, 20 years. And so you don't want to be the one out there getting cervical cancer, girl. So just stay on top of that follow-up. So the way that we follow abnormal pap smears, once you've had that colposcopy, if everything looks okay and we can repeat that pap in a year, then you're going to come back every single year until you have had 3 negative pap smears in a row. So every single year until you have had 3 consecutive negative pap smears is how you're going to follow that up. Now, once you've finished those 3 consecutive negative pap smears, then you can go back to regular screening either every 3 or 5 years. But you certainly do not want to skip any of those follow-up appointments, okay? Absolutely key. Now, let's say if the colposcopy showed that you had abnormal cells and they were high-grade lesions, well, then we've got a whole nother conversation to have. And usually what that means is that we're going to need to take you and get a larger biopsy around the area of the cervix where you had abnormal cells. And so that's another conversation for another day. But just know that if your colposcopy that you had in follow-up for your abnormal pap comes back abnormal, there's several options that we have. And so we would totally discuss that, or your GYN would discuss that with you. So follow-up is really the take-home point of this. Make sure that you're getting your screenings as you're supposed to. And if you have an abnormal pap, make sure you have a conversation with your gynecologist and understand exactly where you are. That's super important. So I hope that this video was very informational and that you got a lot out of it. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to comment below. If you enjoyed this video and you learned a lot, then give your girl a thumbs up. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of these videos because, hey girl, it's your world, but you gotta know how to run in it. So we'll see you next time, girl gang. Peace.
See you soon, girl gang. Don't forget to subscribe and comment below.